All right. So I do have some work on the negation that I'd like to talk about, but I think I'd like to defer that until next week. And instead, I would like to talk about token supply management and its relationship to different disciplines. Hello, Attic B. Thanks for joining us. I was just saying that I wanted to talk about theories of token supply management today, uh, and their relationship to various disciplines. So we know that the economists think about the management of currency, but I think there are other disciplines that talk about resources and the laws governing resource management and the consequences of various disciplines upon resource management. And in particular, I want to point out that the cornerstone of physics is the conservation of matter and energy. So whatever matter is in the universe is fixed, and whatever energy is in the universe is fixed, right? Matter and energy are the same thing, but if you were to think about matter, if you were to think about tokens as essentially the matter energy content of a universe, then conservation laws would insist that the supply is fixed. So that's one discipline that we might look to for guidance in terms of how to come up with decent formalisms for thinking about the management of token supply. And again, I'm only talking in the abstract here. I'm not talking about policy for our chain or for any other chain. I'm talking about what formalisms might we turn to in order to get some guidance as to how to calculate and look at the consequences, predict the consequences of various decisions when it comes to token supply. Steve, you raised your hand.
Yes. When you said that uh, um, the token amount of tokens is fixed, so I'm just thinking about how an enterprise or business can ultimately mint more tokens. So perhaps instead of saying, or my thought is that the token supply isn't necessarily meant fixed, but the value that the tokens represent is fixed, perhaps.
I'm talking about something else here. I'm not talking about what I'm asking is whether when we look at different disciplines, what do they tell us in regards to the dynamics of different decisions? So one decision, like physics makes a very clear decision. Physics says the supply of matter slash energy is fixed, right? So if we were to think about physics as a blockchain, right? Physics, the physics blockchain says, this token supply is never going to change. Whatever it was, that's what it is. And that's what it always will be until the heat death of the universe. Does that
Okay.
make sense?
I understand where what you're the relationship or what you're driving at with physics, but I guess I'm still not quite clear or convinced, but that's fine.
I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. This is an objective fact. The objective fact is that the law of conservation of matter and energy means that the matter and energy in the universe is fixed.
That I
And
understand.
okay,
Yes.
and so if we were to, if we in our attempt to model token dynamics, we turned to physics and we said, what if tokens were like matter and energy? then the result of that modeling decision would be the token supply is fixed. That's all I'm saying.
Okay.
I'm saying
Okay.
if
Understood.
we're looking to these disciplines for guidance.
Understood.
And so now there's another paradigm that we can turn to, and that's biology. And so when we look at the biological world around us, we see that life is varying. So one year, the apple orchard may yield more apples, and another year it may yield less apples. One year we may have more trees in the orchard, and one year we may have less trees in the orchard. So from a biological perspective, and again, I'm just talking about turning to the sort of our common sense experience, and then the ways we have formalized that common sense experience to help us ground our thinking about the management of supply, and in particular to come up with a credible formalism that we know is both mathematically sound and at the same time aligns with common sense. So biology investigates systems which have varying supply dynamics, and there are all first year differential equations. You look at predator prey kinds of problems, and you can see that if you start off with a certain supply of wolves and a certain supply of rabbits, and you have a reproduction strategy on the rabbits and a consumption strategy on the wolves, that yields certain kinds of regimes with respect to supply. So those are systems where you have varying supply. Now, what gets very interesting is if you look a little deeper in physics, you see that various quantum field theory proposals are constantly, you have particles constantly being created and annihilated, right? So that it balances out to no net increase or decrease in the supply, and yet there is more of a variance locally than we might think. And then we can also look to physics from the perspective of entropy. We can ask ourselves, well, if tokens were entropy or somehow a measure of entropy, well, then thermodynamics would give us a guidance that the token supply is always increasing. So each of these different disciplines provide different notions of how to manage the supply. I do want to point out that the more the token supply varies, the more complex the formalism becomes. And in fact, it's very, very difficult to design equilibrium systems to begin with. But if we're talking about non-equilibrium thermodynamics, then the systems are incredibly hard. Like, we don't even have consensus on definitions of non-equilibrium thermodynamics. Although there are many scientists, I mean, there's a whole community of scientists who argue that non-equilibrium thermodynamics may be the right paradigm for talking about the origin of life.
Yes.
Yes. Someone was,
But how does that work if you have, let's say, a fixed amount as the target, but then you release them as you go along? The meaning, so you define upfront whether it's 100 or 5 or 500 or whatever billion, and then you say, okay, but within that's the max limit, and this way everybody knows what the eventual supply will be, but then you are doing it incrementally as you need it.
well, that's just another regime. I mean, I'm not sure what you're saying with how does that, because I don't know what the referent of that is.
That being this scheme of
which scheme? I've talked about three of them.
No, the supply is fixed, but it is not. It's minted within that fixed supply on an as-needed basis.
So that's another possible discipline, and right, that's the Bitcoin discipline, right?
I think what we're talking about here is very different, and it all depends on how your token factory works. And if your token factory, if you can use a multi-governance, multi-stakeholder governance to determine the price of the token, which is fixed in, for a period of time, whatever. If you mint exactly the number of tokens that are purchased by an investor or a patron, it's a system that guarantees that the growth of the token is commensurate with the investment that comes in.
So you said a bunch of things. I think we're talking at cross purposes here. My aim in this discussion is to find guidance from existing formalisms. And so some of the most successful formalisms that we've seen. So physics, standard model physics is accurate to some 30 decimal places. General relativity is accurate to some 30 decimal places. Quantum mechanics is accurate to some 30 decimal places. That's pretty damn accurate. This is like the most successful scientific theories we've ever had in the history of humanity, recorded history of humanity, right? So that's high quality, right? That's way better than Six Sigmas, right? So that's one domain that we could look to and say, that's an approach that we could use to help us think about the modeling of a token supply, the modeling and management of token supply, right? Which would then allow us to create a token policy, because now we have some math where we can investigate a decision. And so we take a particular decision, we run the math, and then we say, these are the consequences of that decision. How does that fit with our overall approach? Another approach is to look at, more dynamical supplies such as we might see in a biological system. And then we can also ask ourselves, well, maybe there's something more subtle going on here. Certainly physics is more subtle in this regard. And my sense is that a lot of this has to do with open world versus closed world discussions. So Rao's comment about a total fixed supply versus minting over an asymptotic minting curve, which is the Bitcoin approach. That corresponds to open world versus closed world. In the closed world of Bitcoin, right, where you're now at the the limit of all future histories, the token supply is fixed. Whereas when you're looking at something that is more biological, then it's open world. But then so Jim's comments with respect to price, this is there is no notion of price unless your system is open world, right? Price only relates one token to another, right? So for example, your token to the dollar or your token to the euro, but eventually the dollar and the euro, those are going to be digital currencies. That is a foregone conclusion at this point. So the idea that the idea of price comes with an open world, a set of assumptions about open world, and then more generically, open world means compositional. So in particular, you've got you know that you've got a system, that system is a local description, and that there may be other systems, and that there may be composite systems which include your system. And so my argument would be that open world compositional is better, because we never have a global view, and the extent to which we do have a global view is only a fiction. So that would be where I would tend to lean, but I'm curious as to what other people think. But before we go there, I just want to make sure that people understand the aim of this conversation. It's not to say that one system is better than another, but to explore the consequences of different tokenomic designs, and in particular, those designs as they relate to various regimes, various formalisms. Does that make sense?
It makes
Yes.
a lot of sense.
Yes.
And, I think that the token engineering work, I don't know if you've seen the comments here, but this is a wonderful community
Cool.
about regenerative token engineering with tremendous resources. But, these are the problems that we're going to have. I mean, this is what we have to look at in the long term. But what we have to look at today is more what I'm interested in is, is what we do as an interim step pragmatically with respect to the RPC tokens and other or Dazzle tokens, whatever, in the short term. And
yeah, so the model there is very clear, right?
Yeah, well,
it's like a store. It's like a chemistry lab, right? So you've got a particular lab, and in this lab you have so much hydrogen, you have so much oxygen, you have so much, and there are rules for what happens when you combine your stock and store of these different chemicals. And again, there's a conservation law in action, right? So that the model for the model that Archain has adopted to date is entirely physics chemistry, right? So you've only ever got some fixed supply of any one kind of substance. You may discover new substances, just like in the world today, we might discover some new element, but there's only some. You can say that there's a behind the scenes closed world assumption that in the limit we're going to discover all the different elements, and that the sum total of those is going to add up to the total matter and energy. So it looks like we got a couple of hands raised. So Tomislav and Pratush. couldn't see you before because Jim was screen sharing. Tomislav, you want to go first?
Pratyush raised his hand first.
Oh, okay, go ahead then, Pratyush.
Yeah, did anyone consider identity-based like tokenomics, like distributing, like have a basic identity shard kind of a layer where one person, one identity is like a central point of organizing the blockchain, and then on top of that, whenever you distribute tokens, like it will be given equally to all people, and something along those lines, universal basic income and ideas like this. Has that been like considered? And yeah, that's what I want to bring to the table.
We could consider that, but that is orthogonal to or independent of whether the token supply is fixed or dynamic.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, that's an aspect.
That's a distribution problem, and I'm not focused on the distribution problem currently. What I'm currently focused on is the management of supply.
Yeah, and I think at least from the governance committee perspective, it's been and I guess in other areas too, they've discussed how our chain members, in a sense, they're going to be grandfathered into the RPC co-op, and
yeah, but that's a much more that's a very specific conversation that's not related to the conversation right now. The conversation right now is for any project anywhere, what formalisms could they rely on, and what are the consequences of making those choices to use those formalisms? Tomislav, you've had your hand up for a while. Go ahead.
So I have a few questions. Are you implying that open or closed is exclusive, or can we combine them together? Also,
yeah, that's a good question. Go ahead.
I remember you were talking about attractors in the context of consensus, and it's a long time ago when you were talking with Vlad and Vitalik, and for me that was like super interesting because you were talking about some kind of purpose. Because I look at the tokens and I don't really care about tokens at all. They're just means for something. So can we have some kind of purpose, and then this purpose to guide how we are managing tokens? Because I would like to see tokens die because they fulfill their purpose. Because now, when you have some big wealth, you can leave this to your children, and I don't think this is like a good way. So I would like to see some better management of tokens.
That's interesting. That's very interesting. Yeah, those are very interesting points, actually. So first of all, with respect to closed world versus open world, you can always there's kind of a local versus global, right? So you can have something that is apparently open, but you close it off. So a simple example is you have a lambda term which has some open variables in it, and you close it off with an abstraction, right? Right, and then once you have that abstraction, you can then compose that abstraction with other things. So it is possible to integrate open and closed in a fairly reasonable fashion. Now, with respect to having a life cycle for a token, that's also an interesting question. One could imagine that you have that tokens are more like organisms, right? A token has an opportunity to reproduce, and there are tokens that are more successful at reproducing and tokens that are not more, and that would give you a different kind of supply management, right? Right. So go ahead.
Or some tokens that are becoming toxic, and they must be like purged in a sense.
Yes, or the other way around, the toxic tokens, like in the case of oxygen, right? So the methane breathers, they produced a bunch of oxygen and it killed the methane breathers off. And we got a bunch of oxygen breathers as a consequence. Pratush, do you have your hand up again?
Yeah. So, yeah. So just adding to the what Tomislav was saying about purpose, right, for these tokens. I mean, so this is also something I've been thinking about, that like, because this is along the lines of the conversation that we are discussing, but not exactly, that blockchain, right, in the future will be used as a framework for collective ownership, right? Collective ownership meaning, like, if you're building an infrastructure like something along the lines of global democracy, right? Because these are ideas that will eventually come. That's my interest in this ecosystem also. It started with like, okay, global democracy, universal basic income, a framework for global collective ownership. So I think that, like, what is the purpose of blockchain, right? I think like much more broadly than talking about specific tokens only, is that like eventually we will have like autonomous factories and autonomous organizations that are making, let's say, laptops or like chips or like grain production and so on and so forth. At least that is the kind of vision that I have entered into this problem of understanding blockchain and so on and so forth. So I thought like I should share that. Yeah.
Thank you. I see. I think there's a different notion of purpose that you're talking about versus the purpose that Tomislav is talking about. So again, this is a matter of scope. Tomislav is saying that we can Tomislav, again, correct me if I've got it wrong, but we can talk about the utility of a token, and once the token has served its in that useful capacity, it could potentially disappear.
Yes.
But again, this is quite interesting, right? So if you look at it at the level of chemistry, you could say that a use of hydrogen is that you can combine it with oxygen and get some water. Okay, and then water might have some other uses, such as being a universal solvent. So in that case, while the hydrogen is bound to the oxygen, so it, we have some water lying around, the hydrogen is unavailable, but it hasn't been destroyed. It's bound up with the oxygen, right? So that's one way we might think about the hydrogen is taken out of circulation, so to speak, because it's now involved in a purpose scope. On the other hand, we can look at a higher level of complexity. So in particular, we can look at something like life forms, right? So you could imagine that tokens are not like chemicals, but they're more like amoeba, or even higher, they're higher, greater complexity. They're more like fish, right? So in that case, when another organism, another token, for example, eats a token, then the token is actually consumed and destroyed. So its components, its constituents might not be destroyed, right? So the token might be made of lots of things, but but as a token, you would have to do considerable work to reconstitute it from its components.
Yeah, this makes sense.
Well,
This
go ahead.
This is some kind of evolution in a sense.
Sure, but they're at different levels, right? I'm just saying that there's a way to take something out of circulation because it's bound up in another purpose. This is the hydrogen to water example. and there's a way to take something out of circulation because it is consumed in the sense of living creatures get consumed by other living creatures. But I think the biological metaphor points to something very interesting, which has to do with the menting as a reproductive strategy versus menting as something that is global, right? The interesting thing about biological systems is that no one is, you know, you don't have a co-op overlooking the whole thing saying, you know, how many trees are going to be built, you know, and how many rabbits are going to be there, right? Those kinds of populations might be managed by the action of agents in its environment, but it's not the same as, you know, like in the case of the co-op, where we're saying up front what a particular token supply is. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I think that these questions should be looked at, you know, seriously, that we should think about the token supply and relate it to different management disciplines that we know about and that we have mathematical models for before we just willy-nilly pick something. And in fact, I think a lot of economics has been done rather blindly. A lot of economics has been done post facto, right? So there was this organic emergence of economic agency in the world, right? It was less convenient to bring all your bushels of grain to the market than to bring some chits, right? You leave the grain in the silos, you bring the chits to the marketplace, and then you make a deal with the miller and you know, other parties on various lots of grain, and then, you know, ultimately you redeem those chits for the lots of grain, and they're distributed according to the deals that you've made. Steve has a hand up. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I think you said something that may have helped with my understanding as far as this this minting. So I just want to repeat it to make sure I understood what I heard. So in this world of tokens that combine with other tokens, it's this creation of new tokens becomes automated based on need, as opposed to this current environment we're in, where there's an agent such as a co-op, which goes through a voting mechanism and decides how many to generate. So was that what you were suggesting, was an automated creation of tokens based on need?
That becomes a possibility. I'm not suggesting that that's what we should do. What I'm suggesting is, if we look at different management regimes, then the space of possible token supply regimes becomes more clear to us. I don't want to jump to any decision yet because I don't know anything. I'm ignorant of what
Sure.
is good management for these kinds of things.
Okay, understood. So now we sort of starting with the canvas of possibilities, and now we're sort of exploring what's out there. So
right.
Okay.
And so what I'm asking is, should the token supply be like matter and energy in the way matter and energy is conceived in physics? That's one way we can think about token management, right? And it's not a terrible choice. And the reason it's not a terrible choice is because we have a several 100-year, very successful program that allows us to say very deep and rich things about the behavior of systems that have this kind of characteristic, where you have a fixed supply of something. right? So that's, you know, like, so, you know, all of these wonderful tools, like, you know, the Lagrangian, right, and the Hamiltonian, and a whole bunch of other kinds of dynamical regimes are available to us if we make those kinds of choices. On the other hand, what's hidden in that is a closed world assumption, right? So like Bob Cook put it really very nicely. You know, he says physicists suffer from a very, very heavy dose of omniscient positivism, right? So they believe that they can see the whole universe all at once, right? And this is at the heart of the disconnect between general relativity and quantum mechanics. Is because there isn't a compositional model, and because it isn't compositional, you don't get scale invariant models. So that's a critique, and it may very well be the kind of critique we want to apply to token management. Another example would be the kind of the combinatorics of chemistry, right? Chemistry is very successful, right? We've seen now hundreds of years of extremely successful application of chemistry and our scientific and mathematical understanding of chemistry. But chemistry is, again, a closed world assumption. It's more recombinant than physics, but it's still essentially closed world. Pratyush, you have a point. Go ahead.
Yeah. Are we like, the other way to approach this question is to ask, are we like, instead of looking at the token dynamics and so on, are we like trying towards some kind of like sociological objectives, like who benefits, like in that language, right? Sociological language, to talk about token models, right? I just want to bring this up for discussion.
Yeah, I understand. I'm reticent to apply sociological models at this stage. What I first want to do is to say, what are all of the different disciplines we might employ, right? Just to kind of list them, and then evaluate them in terms of different pressures. One of those pressures might be sociological. Tomislav, you have a thought.
I'm thinking about the closed world, and is there going to be always tendency to try to understand it in more open way? Because I learned recently about Roger Penrose's model of conformal cyclic cosmology, and he's basically my understanding is that he's trying to explain that this closed world is still open in the sense that eons can repeat, and they are like the end of one eon is the beginning of the another. So my question is, can this closed world be even considered as solution? Because, you know,
it is, as I've said before, it is possible to navigate between closed world and open world, right? But if you're going to do that, then it's bigger than so for example, one would have to ask, you know, is there the same amount of matter / energy in one eon versus another, right? Does the law of you know, I mean, and another, you know, what's his nose, Lee Smolin has been arguing for an evolutionary account of the laws of physics. He argues that the laws of physics change, and then the question is, they change with respect to what, and how radically do they change, in what period of time, in inverted commas, like. And how would the laws of physics, how would a change in the laws of physics propagate, right? So like, suppose the laws of physics Sorry. Many people are demanding my time. But anyway, that's too far afield. All I'm saying is it is possible to navigate between closed world and open world, but essentially what you're saying then is that a closed world is only ever a local model. It's not globally closed, it's only locally closed. Whereas in standard model physics, it is globally closed. Jim.
Yes. If we say that the purpose is to represent the value we have created, or the value that has been created, we can say that the supply can be the amount of the investment, which is related to the value produced, hopefully.
Yeah.
And it's unbounded, but it's not closed.
Okay, I understand, but that doesn't actually change. First of all, it doesn't give me a set of formalisms that I might relate it to. But more importantly, I would love to discover these kinds of things, right? So there's too much in your diagram here. There's too much that's already assumed. Like price assumes open world.
Well, the price.
As soon as you say price, that means you made an assumption about open world, and that may or may not be correct.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in our case, it's a matter of governance, and that could be automated or manual. We're not saying that. What we're saying is that.
No, but this model does not. This model makes a bunch of assumptions that we've already said they're models which don't line up with this. So, for example, tokens could be chemicals. Tokens could be organisms, right? So like here's a simple way to look at it. Are tokens particles? Are tokens chemicals? Are tokens organisms? So these are different levels of complexity to the notion of token. And each of them come with a different management regime.
Yeah.
Right.
And in theory,
that's what I'm trying to do by that.
Yeah, and the theory is awesome. I guess I'm looking at an evolutionary path toward that solution as opposed to
I don't have a solution yet. I'm trying to like have us discuss possible solutions. So it looks like we have two people with raised hands. So we have Tomislav and Pratyush. Pratyush, did you want to go ahead?
No, I had nothing to say.
Oh, okay. Or then Tomislav.
So I'm so much interested in your view of local view and compositional view. And I watched again your Weber jam with Brian Beckman about monads and coordinate system. And this is, I remember when I was the first time. It's so insightful. And I have a question about if we have the local coordinate system, how this local coordinate system can see itself from outside. Because you explained that we can compose local coordinate systems, but I have difficulty to understand how I can reference somehow, because I don't know how these local systems will be composed. So can you maybe say something about that?
I can. I mean, typically the way that's done is like in a tree, right? So at a given local coordinate system can't see the other coordinate system, but if you go up a level to the composite coordinate system, you can see both of them. Or it's just like URLs, right? So like a given subtree of a given URL namespace can't see the another subtree, which is branching before at a point before this branches, right? So there's You see what I'm saying? Where you just walk up to least common ancestor and
but this implies that this is already composed. But
no,
I'm somehow
no. Like
Mhm.
you can always imagine that there's a context, like a zipper, right? There's a context and there's a local
Mhm.
tree, and you shove the local tree into the context. And then
Mhm.
now you've got a tree, and there's another context, and you can shove that into that tree, into that context. But
Mhm.
that's I'm trying to drive, I'm trying to keep the scope of the conversation to just token management, right?
Mhm.
I'd like us to think about this this question of, are tokens particles? Are tokens chemicals, or are they organisms? Right? Because each one of those different layers gives you a different management regime, right? Particles means you have a fixed supply, right? And you have this omniscient view of the total supply, at least with respect to that project, let's say. Chemicals means that you don't necessarily you have a fixed supply, quote unquote, but you can create new tokens based upon the chemistry, right? So if you have some combination rules for how the tokens get recombined, then you might get, water tokens from hydrogen and oxygen tokens, as an example, right? So that's another regime. But at the end of the day, you neither create nor destroy atoms. And then above that, you have yet another thing where tokens can reproduce themselves. So in that supply regime, in that supply management regime, you can get all kinds of crazy dynamics. But it's but for example, nobody in the co-op has to be worried about the minting. The minting happens as a result of the sort of the life cycle interactions amongst the different organisms. And there may be many more regimes, but just those three, I think, are worth contemplating and seeing. Like it's like there isn't an economist on the planet that thinks about the possibility of money reproducing itself. Like there's no Nobel laureate economist who has made that comment. There's no Nobel laureate that I'm aware of that talks about currency like chemicals. But each one, like once it becomes software, then we get to choose what kind of supply management regime it is. And since we have that choice in front of us, we should make the choice informed. Does that make sense? Do people understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, I understand where you're
Yes.
going.
Mhm.
No, I think so. I mean, but to some extent, well, we can think of it like the game of life, really, and how tokens might be created. The thing is that all of these models are possible, and really we can't prevent them from happening, no matter how we design things to some extent. But
well, I agree with you 100%, Jim. But to like right now, what we can say is we've had millennia of a currency management of one form or another, and until currency became digital, I have seen nowhere in the literature, nowhere in the history of economics, anyone ever talking about tokens as having the complexity of chemistry. I've seen no one talking about tokens having the complexity of organisms. And that's because, people look at this, people look in terms of what they've been exposed to. But once we have digital currency, you can have these other regimes. And I'm just saying, let's use our best math and our best experience to come up with a design that is rational and makes sense. And then maybe others will come up with different models, and then we can evaluate them next to each other, and we'll see what the properties are. Just, you know, it's like this feels to me like an enormous opportunity that we're just barely scratching the surface of. And I would love for us to you know, to do the work.
Yeah, I mean, but I think it's not just the beauty and utility of the models themselves. There are also constraints, right? We have the legal, regulatory, current, say, either member or investor behavior. All of these things also need to be met with whatever coin design we do, because we are seeking either the right to survive or the right to you know, take somebody else's money or things like that. So it's not just what is the model. I mean, there is some conversation there, but also how does the model interact with the immediate objectives and constraints that we need to work with. So that's really the so there's quite a bit of work that needs to be done there. And perhaps if we approach it from that angle, in terms of any system is going to exist within its environment, and say, okay, what are the environmental requirements? And then say which of this makes sense, or, you know, how effective can we be within that, I think is something to think about. I mean, and I admit the interaction with the environment is two-way, but at where we are, or in the initial stages of any system, it's more accounting for the environment. And I think any effects in the opposite direction, where the system then changes the environment, happen over time. And I think we need to be aware of that.
I agree with you that taking into account the environment is important. I also want to say that it could be incredibly limiting. So if there isn't an economist on the planet that's thought about tokens as chemistry or tokens as as organism, then none of the regulatory apparatus will match, right? It just won't line up, which can be both good and bad. It could be good in the sense that what we're doing is, the SEC can't say it's a security. It doesn't look like a security because it doesn't look like anything they've ever seen before. So it doesn't match any of their frameworks. And so we avoid a bunch of legal issues. And so this is why I'm saying it's actually worthwhile to take a kind of principled approach to this. Like, let's find where our assumptions are and see whether or not they actually apply. And in particular, are our assumptions preventing us from accessing models of coordination that would be many times more effective if we'd only thought to use them? With that, thank you very much. Very interesting and enlightening conversation. I very much appreciate it. And I'll see many of you in the Dev Stand-Up in just a few minutes. Very, very good conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg.
Thanks.
Thank you, everyone.